Welcome to Acts chapter 5. Now, can I suggest that in order for you to get the most out of this Bible study, that you have a read of chapter 5 if you haven't done so already. I'm not going to take us through a summary of the chapter, and we're not going to go through it verse by verse. So I feel that it's really important that you've read it through so that you know what's happening throughout the whole story of this chapter. Because what I'd like to do is just pick up on 4 key themes that run throughout this passage. There's the idea of temple, transformation, teaching, and testing. So let's start by looking at this idea of the temple. If you remember from last time, from chapter 4, we were thinking about the power of the Jewish authorities and how in their minds they were just defending the temple and what they thought was God's will and following what had been God's letter of the law. They believed that the temple was the place where God was present, where God lived, in the Holy of Holies. And they, the Jewish authorities, were the guardians of this central shrine, and so they were just trying to protect it. But Tom Wright suggests that in the story of Ananias and Sapphira, we have a challenge to the temple. So let's, in order to explain that, have a closer look at this story. So we heard the example of Barnabas, who sold his land and gave all the money to the community. And C.K. Barrett suggests that this must not have been what was expected, because otherwise it wouldn't have been remarkable and noteworthy, and we wouldn't have the story of Barnabas and what he did in the Bible. So it wasn't something that was expected of the followers to sell their land and give the money to the community. And so Ananias and Sapphira didn't have to do this. They didn't have to sell their property, and they didn't have to give all the money to the community. They were quite within their rights to keep some of that money back. The problem wasn't in the action, it was in the fact that they lied. They lied to the apostles, they lied to the community, and so in effect, they lied to God. Now, lying to God isn't ever going to end well. But I have to say that when I read this story again, I thought it was a bit drastic that both Ananias and Sapphira could be struck down and killed for one lie. If that was the case in life, if everyone who ever told a lie was struck down, I wonder how many people would be left in our world. But then I read Tom Wright's commentary and it made it a little bit clearer. You see, God was at work in this Christian community. This was apparent through the miracles and the signs, including the many healings, and healing that happened even when a shadow of one of the apostles passed over someone. So God was definitely at work in this community and at work powerfully. And so the community was holy. Where they went was holy ground. And it could be argued that since God was present right there with them, then they had replaced the temple as the place where God dwelled, where God was found. Because this new community was such a holy and sacred place, every sin was magnified. And there are links here back with the story of when the Ark of the Covenant was brought to Jerusalem in 2 Samuel chapter 6. Nobody was meant to touch the Ark, but as the Ark was travelling, there was a moment where it was a bit unsteady and somebody reached out to steady it, and they were struck down and died. And in the Old Testament times, no one could approach the temple who was unfit to do so. Only the high priest was allowed in the Holy of Holies, and even then it was only once in the year. This was powerful holiness. And sometimes I think in today's society we can see God as too familiar and forget the awe and the wonder and the holiness that surround him. Powerful holiness. Now, since the early church had taken on this holiness and were doing amazing things in Jesus' name, they'd become the temple of the living God. And as Wright says, there is no wonder that God took them seriously. He says, to name the name of Jesus and to invoke the Holy Spirit is to claim to be the temple of the living God, and that is bound to have consequences. And Wright goes on to explain a little more the significance of lying, remembering that it was the lie of Ananias and Sapphira which was the problem rather than the action of what they did. And he argues that, as Christians, we believe that God is the one who will eventually bring about his new kingdom, his kingdom on earth. And in this new kingdom, he will right all wrongs and sort out all cheating and lying. So, Wright argues, when we lie, we're declaring that we don't like the world as it is, and we're pretending that it is somehow more the way we want it to be. And therefore, we're saying that we don't trust God to look after the world and sort it out in his own time and in his own way. He says we can't have it both ways. If we live by the claim that God, through Jesus, is going to sort the world out and set it right, then we must be prepared to be judged by that claim also. Hence why Ananias and Sapphira died. But on the positive side, if we live by God's power and promise, then we can expect to see that power as a reality. And I'm reminded of Jesus' words that to those who are given much, much will be expected. And yet, if we're prepared to give our all, we will truly see God's power at work. So this idea of where the temple is, where God was dwelling, is really important. The Jewish authorities were fighting against the early church and trying in their own minds to defend the temple, the building, as they saw it. But actually, maybe the early church had become the temple, the house of God, the place where God dwells. And so holiness in this community was not an optional extra. To be part of the community was to share in the holiness, and they either lived by it or they didn't. Ananias and Sapphira didn't. I was really challenged by this passage and this explanation of it. How often do we lie? Or how often do we hear lies in today's world? There are the outright false claims, then there are the white lies, and then there are the times when we don't necessarily lie, but we don't tell the whole truth. Are we as guilty as Ananias and Sapphira? If we are to have the Spirit of God in us, then we become temples, the places where the Holy Spirit, where God dwells. Jesus spoke of himself in such terms as a temple that would be destroyed but rebuilt again in 3 days. The presence of God was with Jesus and was Jesus. And so if we have the presence of God within us, then we too are his temples. Our lives are holy ground. And that is a huge challenge to us all, to live holy lives, to live lives worthy of that holy ground and worthy of God's presence within us. So the first theme is that idea of temple. Our second T is transformation. And transformation occurs so many times in this chapter. As we've just discussed, we have the transformation of this group of believers into holy ground of God. We have the transformation of those who came to be healed. It says all of them were healed. The transformation of the situation where the believers had been put in prison, but then all of a sudden an angel lets them out and they can continue with their teaching. We have the transformation of Peter and the other apostles, the courage that it must have taken for them to go back into the temple courts and keep teaching, even though they knew that it was going to mean they were going to get into trouble again. And we even have the transformation of the Sanhedrin, when Gamaliel got up and suggested that they didn't kill these men, but let them go. It is a chapter of transformations, and no doubt you can think of others from this passage too. And also the fact that God was continuing through this to add to their number. And I was again struck by something Tom Wright wrote when he said that it is when the church acts in power and makes a difference in the world that people take the message seriously. And Barclay said something similar. He wrote, "People will always throng to a church where lives are being changed." The gospel message, the message of Jesus, is transformational. We should expect it to make a difference in our lives, in other people's lives, and in the lives of our church. If it isn't, if lives aren't being changed, then have we missed something? Are we doing something wrong? If you're a Christian watching this, then just think for a moment, how would your life be different if you weren't a Christian? Or how was it different when you weren't a Christian? And if you're watching this and you aren't a Christian, then how would you like or expect your life to change if you were? There needs to be a recognisable difference in the life of a Christian, in the life of a Christian church, and in the ways of that church. It is when the church acts in power and makes a difference in the world that people take the message seriously. When people can see God at work in us, in our lives, in our churches, they see the difference being a Christian makes to us. That's when they take our message seriously. The third T is teaching. The disciples just couldn't help themselves. They just couldn't stop teaching the people about Jesus and about God's purpose through Jesus. They'd already been told, as we looked at in chapter 4, not to speak of Jesus anymore. And yet we find them back in the temple courts and still teaching, even after they'd been put in prison for the night. The angel or messenger of the Lord, and it is unclear about which of those two concepts that the word means, but either imply that it was God's will and God at work. So the angel frees them and sends them back to the temple so that first thing in the morning they're back there teaching again. This teaching wasn't an optional extra for those apostles. This was at the heart of who they now were and what their faith was all about. The disciples had embarked on a new life, a very different life since Jesus' death and resurrection, which now involved living as a community, sharing everything together, supporting one another. There was a new thinking about their property and how they used it. And Tom Wright says that what you do with your money and possessions declares loudly what sort of a community you are. And they were still worshipping in the temple, but now they were also meeting in homes and praying together and sharing and eating. Their way of life had changed. But this wasn't just a new life in action. It needed to be a new life in their words and their speech too. And in Proverbs 12, verse 14, and in Jesus' own words in Matthew 15, we read that whatever comes out of the mouth is an overflow from our hearts. And these disciples' hearts were so overflowing with God, and their outlet was to teach and preach about Jesus. Now, the whole concept of this new way of life, this new faith, would have been completely alien to the Jews in Jerusalem. This was a different way of life to what the people were used to. It was a completely new way of living out their faith. It no longer involved the same rituals and rules and laws. And the people needed to know what this new way of life, this new faith was all about. They needed teaching. They needed teaching about Jesus, what he said, what he did, how God was at work through him, what his death and resurrection meant, and how Jesus' life was the culmination of all the Jews had been waiting for and expecting. They needed to know about this way of life and how to live it. And Tom Wright says that even today, we need teaching, or Christianity wanders in the dark and can easily fall off a cliff. And again, this made me think, the true Christian message and Christian culture is very different from the culture of the world today. If we want people to know about Jesus and to live in his way, then we need to teach people about what that means. We can't assume that people know what faith, and Christian faith especially, is all about, or even who Jesus was, or still is, or why he came to earth, why he died, why he was crucified. We need to teach people the facts of faith. And also for me, it called into play the question, can you be a Christian and not part of a church? And this particular line of discussion would say that you need teaching as part of your faith journey. Now, in today's world of technology, that teaching isn't just available in a church building, as we've proved over the last few months, and by putting this Bible study on YouTube and Facebook. We can be taught in our own homes, but we need to be taught from whatever source that comes. Otherwise, our faith can wander in the darkness and easily fall off a cliff. So we've thought about the temple and our Christian communities being a temple of God. We've looked at transformation and all the ways God works to transform lives. And then teaching and how important that is in our faith journey. So the last T I want us to consider from this chapter is testing. Now, throughout Acts, the early church is tested. The apostles and followers are constantly being threatened and arrested and imprisoned and punished. It was a really testing time for the early church. But I want us to think more specifically about the type of testing which Gamaliel suggested. When the Sanhedrin were considering what should be done with the apostles, he suggested that they let them go, that time would tell. If the apostles' message was of man, then in time it would die off. And if it was from God, then nothing would be able to stop it. And so the people of the Sanhedrin had two choices, really. Either this new movement was leading people astray from Judaism and therefore wasn't good, or that God's kingdom really was on its way. And the chief priests were convinced of the former. Maybe their own interests were blinding them. Maybe they'd stopped hearing God speaking to them. Or maybe they were so stuck on the rules that they'd forgotten the God who was behind them. But for whatever reason, they saw this group of followers as not doing things properly, as challenging Judaism. The early church were not respecting the well-known fact that God worked through the temple. They were also blaming the Jewish authorities for crucifying who they claimed to be the Messiah, and making out that the Jewish authorities were actually the enemy, that they'd sinned in all of this. And so the authorities weren't convinced that this movement was a good thing. They were convinced that this early church movement was leading people from the proper path which they were trying to God. And it took Gamaliel to point out that they needed not to be so quick to judge, but to give it time to see what played out. Now, Gamaliel is a well-known historical figure. He was known as one of the greatest rabbis of all times. He lived his life in an exemplary way, and he knew the law better than anyone else had ever known it. Gamaliel was a Pharisee. He wasn't, though, the type of Pharisee who was political and zealous and used violence to uphold the law across the land. He was the type of Pharisee who followed God's rule, his law, to the letter in his own life, but was not prepared to fight others who didn't choose this way of life. He belonged to the group that were more kind of live and let live. But in this live and let live attitude, it shows some of the Pharisaical beliefs about fate and free will. They believed that all things were in God's hands, but yet man was still responsible for his or her own actions. The phrase Barclay used is, "Everything is foreseen, and yet freedom of choice is given." And this is what Gamaliel encouraged the Sanhedrin to act by. And using examples from the past of people who'd come and claimed such things before, the first example of Theodas is a little difficult to place historically. But using these people as examples, he more or less suggests that they test out the apostles' claims by waiting to see what happened. If the early church movement fizzled out like all the others had, then so be it, that was their problem taken away. But if it was actually that God was at work, then that was a fight that the Sanhedrin didn't want to initiate. Sometimes we need to work out whether or not something is of God. We may get an opportunity to do something, or go somewhere, or change our life in a specific way. We may have an idea of a way forward, and we want to know if it is of God. Now, that doesn't mean that God's will won't face challenges. The early church certainly didn't cruise through life without any opposition, but God gave them the strength to keep at it and to enable it all to come to fruition. So they are my 4 T's based on chapter 5. And as always, I have a question for you to reflect on each one of them. So firstly, the temple. If the temple of God is the place where God dwells, and we believe that God's Spirit is within us, then do we live our lives as though we are God's temple? Do we strive to live lives worthy of God's holy ground, especially in terms of lying? And then in terms of transformation, how do we need to change our lives? How does our church need to change to show the world that we are serious and that God is transformational? Then thinking about teaching. How can we learn more about God and about the Bible and about faith? What options are open to us? Where can we pursue so that we can learn more? And how can we teach others about this faith? And then lastly, testing. When we're trying to make a decision, do we trust that God's will work out? And do we have the faith to push the doors and see if they shut on us or if they open into a whole new world? So thank you for sharing in this Bible study today. Next time we'll be looking at chapter 6, which is, in terms of the number of verses, quite a bit shorter a chapter. But no doubt there'll still be a lot for us to learn.